In the remote wilderness of northern Montana, where morning mist clings to forgotten swamps and silence echoes with loss, a starving, emaciated bobcat wandered through a remote valley and became trapped in the thick mud of a swampy lake. Too weak to free itself, it lay stuck for 6 hours, motionless and barely breathing, covered in mud and weighed down by exhaustion and hunger. Just as it was on the brink of death, Henry Whitmore, a ranger who was out fishing, heard faint groaning. Following the sound, he discovered the bobcat and was overwhelmed with sorrow. What would you do when its gaze holds no wild ferocity, only a dim, fading plea for help? Henry is faced with a choice that will set in motion a rescue against impossible odds and forge a connection so profound it will change him forever. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist hung heavy over Cedar Valley, a remote stretch of wilderness in northern Montana where the Rockies gradually gave way to rolling forests and hidden wetlands. Henry Whitmore sat on the weathered porch of his cabin, steam rising from his coffee mug as he watched the sun pierce through the fog. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and hands roughened by years of outdoor work, Henry had called this isolated corner of America home for the past 12 years. He'd come here after Martha died, unable to bear the emptiness of their suburban home in Billings. The cancer had taken her quickly, too quickly for either of them to truly prepare. In the wilderness, he found a different kind of silence, one filled with bird calls, rustling leaves, and the occasional howl of distant predators. It was a silence that didn't echo with memories of hospital rooms and final goodbyes. This particular morning in early September carried a hint of the coming autumn. Henry finished his coffee and gathered his fishing gear, planning to spend the day at Willow Swamp, a marshy lake about 3 miles from his cabin. The area was known for its excellent bass fishing, though few people ventured there due to the treacherous terrain and the thick, sucking mud that bordered much of the water's edge. Meanwhile, several miles away, a young bobcat struggled through the underbrush. At barely a year old, the male cat should have weighed around 20 pounds, but starvation had reduced him to little more than fur stretched over bones. His mother had been killed by a vehicle on the highway 2 weeks earlier, leaving him to fend for himself before he'd fully learned to hunt efficiently. The bobcat's ribs showed prominently through his matted coat, and his normally bright eyes had dulled with exhaustion. He'd managed to catch a few mice and birds, but it wasn't enough to sustain a growing predator. Desperation had driven him farther from his familiar territory, searching for easier prey or carrion, anything to quiet the gnawing hunger in his belly. The scent of water drew him toward Willow Swamp. Perhaps he could find frogs or water birds, something slower than the rabbits that continually eluded his weakened reflexes. He approached the marsh cautiously, his natural wariness battling with desperate need. Henry had been fishing for 2 hours, enjoying the solitude and the gentle lapping of water against his small aluminum boat. He'd caught 3 decent-sized bass and was considering heading back when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the reeds. But there it was again, a low, mournful groan that seemed to come from the far side of the swamp. His first thought was that another hiker had gotten into trouble. It wouldn't be the first time someone had underestimated the dangers of the marsh. Henry quickly pulled up his anchor and started the small outboard motor, navigating carefully through the shallow channels toward the source of the sound. The bobcat had made a fatal error. In his weakened state, he'd misjudged the stability of what appeared to be solid ground, but was actually a thin crust over deep, viscous mud. The moment his weight settled on it, he'd broken through, his hind legs sinking immediately into the mire. Panic had made him struggle, and struggling had only made him sink deeper. Now, 6 hours later, he was trapped up to his chest, his front paws barely finding purchase on a partially submerged log. The mud had dried and caked on his exposed fur, adding weight to his already exhausted frame. He'd long since given up struggling, conserving what little energy remained for breathing. The groaning sounds were involuntary, escaping with each labored breath. Henry cut the motor as he approached the marsh's edge, not wanting to create waves that might worsen the situation. What he saw made his heart constrict with a familiar ache. The young bobcat looked like a statue partially melted into the earth. Only the slight rise and fall of its chest and those heartbreaking sounds indicating life remained. "Oh, buddy," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What have you gotten yourself into?" The bobcat's eyes, glazed with exhaustion, shifted slightly at the sound. There was no fear left in them, no fierce wildness. Just a dim awareness and perhaps, Henry thought, the faintest spark of hope. Henry had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that approaching a wild predator, even a dying one, was dangerous. Injured animals could summon surprising strength when cornered. But something in those eyes, something in the way the cat looked at him without aggression or panic, made him act. He maneuvered his boat as close as he dared to the mud flat, then carefully stepped out onto a more stable section of ground, testing each footfall. From his boat, he grabbed the rope he always carried for emergencies. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he fashioned a loose loop. "Easy now," he murmured, both to the bobcat and himself. "I'm going to help you, but you've got to work with me here." The first attempt was a failure. The rope slipped off the bobcat's mud-slicked body before Henry could get proper leverage. The second attempt wasn't much better. Each time Henry pulled, he risked losing his own footing on the treacherous ground. On the third try, he managed to work the rope under the bobcat's front legs, creating a makeshift harness. The cat barely reacted, too exhausted to resist or assist. Henry braced himself and pulled, his muscles straining against the suction of the mud. "Come on," he grunted, feeling his boots starting to slip. "Don't give up on me now." For a terrifying moment, Henry thought they were both going to end up in the mud. Then, with a wet, sucking sound, the bobcat began to move. Inch by inch, Henry worked him free, until finally, with one last heave, the cat came loose and collapsed on firmer ground. Henry quickly dragged the exhausted animal, he couldn't have weighed more than 12 pounds, to his boat, lifting him carefully over the side. The bobcat lay where placed, eyes half closed, breathing shallow but steady. Henry could see now how young he was, probably just past kittenhood and drastically underweight. The journey back to Henry's cabin took on a desperate urgency. He pushed the small motor to its limit, one hand on the tiller and the other gently resting on the bobcat's mud-caked fur, offering what comfort he could. "Stay with me," he found himself saying repeatedly. "We're almost there. Just stay with me." The bobcat's eyes remained open, fixed on Henry's face with an intensity that seemed to transcend species. In that gaze, Henry saw not a wild animal, but a fellow creature clinging to life, trusting in the kindness of a stranger. At the cabin, Henry faced a dilemma. He couldn't bring a muddy, wild animal inside, but the cat needed immediate care. He compromised by setting up a makeshift station on his covered porch. First, he needed to remove the mud that was weighing down the exhausted animal and potentially restricting his breathing. Using lukewarm water from buckets and gentle pressure from old towels, Henry slowly washed away the caked mud. The bobcat remained unnaturally still through the process, too weak to protest. As the mud came away, Henry could see the true extent of the cat's emaciation. Every rib was visible, hip bones protruded sharply, and his coat, which should have been thick and glossy, was dull and patchy. "Jesus," Henry breathed. "How long have you been on your own, little guy?" Once clean, Henry wrapped the bobcat in his softest blanket, an old quilt Martha had made years ago. He'd never been able to part with it, and now it seemed fitting that it should offer comfort to another soul in need. The question of food was pressing. Henry knew that starving animals needed to be fed carefully. Too much too fast could be fatal. He had some venison in his freezer from last season's hunt. He thawed a small portion and cut it into tiny pieces, warming it slightly to make it more appealing. When he offered the first piece, holding it gently near the bobcat's mouth, the cat's eyes focused with the first real sign of alertness. Slowly, weakly, he took the meat, chewing with visible effort. "That's it," Henry encouraged. "Nice and slow. There's plenty more where that came from." For the next hour, Henry fed the bobcat small pieces of meat, allowing time between each for digestion. With each bite, the cat seemed to gain a fraction more strength, though he remained too weak to stand. Throughout the feeding, their eyes rarely broke contact. Henry found himself talking, sharing stories of the forest, of the fish in the lake, of anything that came to mind. The sound of his voice seemed to calm the cat, who listened with those intense amber eyes. As the immediate crisis passed, Henry knew he needed professional help. He'd done what he could, but the bobcat needed veterinary care and proper rehabilitation. With reluctance, part of him wanted to keep caring for the creature himself. He called the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center, located 2 hours away in Kalispell. "Montana Wildlife Rescue, this is Jennifer." Henry explained the situation, his voice catching slightly as he described the bobcat's condition. Jennifer's response was immediate and professional. "You did the right thing, Mr. Whitmore. We'll have a team there within 2 hours. Keep him warm and calm, but don't give him any more food. We'll want to assess his condition before feeding him further." After hanging up, Henry returned to the porch where the bobcat lay in Martha's quilt. The cat's eyes were closed now, but his breathing was steadier, deeper. Henry sat in his old rocking chair nearby, maintaining a quiet vigil. "You know," he said softly, "I came out here to be alone. Thought that's what I needed after Martha passed. But maybe we're not meant to be completely alone. Maybe we're supposed to help each other when we can." The bobcat's eyes opened at the sound of his voice, that steady amber gaze finding his once more. Henry could swear he saw understanding there, a recognition that transcended the barrier between human and wild animal. The rescue team arrived exactly 2 hours later, as promised. Jennifer, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and efficient movements, immediately knelt beside the bobcat. "Oh, you poor baby," she murmured, gently examining him. "He's definitely malnourished and dehydrated, probably orphaned from the look of him. Too young to be on his own." She looked up at Henry. "You saved his life, Mr. Whitmore. Another few hours and—" She didn't need to finish. Henry nodded, his throat tight. The team worked quickly but gently, transferring the bobcat to a specialized carrier. As they prepared to load him into their van, Henry made a request. Could I say goodbye?" Jennifer smiled. "Of course." Henry knelt by the carrier, meeting those amber eyes one last time. The bobcat, despite his weakness, lifted his head slightly, "You're going to be okay now," Henry whispered. "These folks will take good care of you. Get strong, live wild and free. That's all any of us can ask for, right?" He could have sworn the bobcat blinked slowly at him, a gesture that in domestic cats signaled trust and affection. Then the team was loading the carrier into the van, and Henry stood watching, Martha's quilt clutched in his hands. Jennifer paused before getting in the van. "Would you like updates on his progress?" "We don't usually, but given the circumstances..." "I'd like that very much," Henry replied. As the van pulled away, Henry caught one last glimpse through the rear window. The bobcat had turned in his carrier, amber eyes fixed on Henry until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. The cabin felt different that evening. The silence that had been Henry's companion for so long seemed less complete somehow. He found himself on the porch, looking out at the forest, Martha's quilt draped over his lap. A week later, his phone rang. Jennifer's cheerful voice greeted him. "Mr. Whitmore? I thought you'd like to know. Your bobcat is doing wonderfully. He's gained 2 pounds already, and his energy is returning. We've named him Hope, after the way he looked at you. The staff said they've never seen such trust between a wild animal and a human." Henry gripped the phone tighter, unexpected emotion welling up. "Hope?" he repeated. That's a good name." "He's got a long recovery ahead," Jennifer continued. "But we're optimistic. He's young and strong, and now that he's getting proper nutrition, his true personality is emerging. He's quite the character, playful but still wonderfully wild." Over the following weeks, Jennifer called regularly with updates. Hope continued to thrive, learning to hunt properly with the help of the rehabilitation team, growing into the powerful predator he was meant to be. Henry found himself looking forward to these calls, to hearing about Hope's progress. A month after the rescue, Henry received a special invitation. Hope was ready to be moved to a protected semi-wild enclosure where he would live while the team determined if he could eventually be released back into the wild. Would Henry like to see him one more time? The drive to Kalispell seemed both endless and too short. Henry wasn't sure what to expect. Would Hope remember him? Did it matter if he did? Jennifer met him at the facility and led him to a viewing area overlooking a large natural enclosure. "He's in there," she said softly. "We'll see if he comes out." Henry waited, his eyes scanning the trees and rocks of the enclosure. Then, movement. Hope emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, and Henry's breath caught. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the skeletal, mud-covered creature from the swamp. In his place stood a magnificent young bobcat, his coat glossy and thick, muscles rippling beneath the fur, eyes bright and alert. Hope paused, his nose testing the air. Then his head turned, and those amber eyes found Henry's through the viewing window. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Hope took a few steps closer, his gaze never wavering. "He remembers you," Jennifer whispered. That's incredibly rare." Henry placed his hand against the window, and Hope sat, still watching him with that steady, intelligent gaze. They stayed like that for several minutes. Two souls who had found each other in a moment of desperate need, acknowledging a bond that would endure despite the necessary separation. Finally, Hope stood, gave what Henry could only describe as a nod, and melted back into the landscape of his enclosure. The wild had reclaimed him, as it should. "Will he be released?" Henry asked as they walked back to the parking lot. "We're hopeful," Jennifer replied. He's showing all the right behaviors. We think by spring he'll be ready. There's a protected area not far from where you found him, actually. Good prey population, no highways nearby. He'll have a real chance." Henry drove home with a full heart. That night, he sat on his porch with Martha's quilt, looking out at the forest. Somewhere out there, Hope was learning to be wild again, to be the predator nature intended. And somewhere in Hope's memory, Henry liked to believe, lived the echo of their connection. Proof that compassion could bridge any gap, that kindness could exist between all Earth's creatures. The seasons turned. Winter came and went, and with spring came another call from Jennifer. Hope had been successfully released. He'd taken to his freedom immediately, disappearing into the wilderness with the confidence of a creature who belonged there. "We put a tracking collar on him," Jennifer added, "just to monitor his progress for the first year. He's established a territory about 10 miles from your cabin, Mr. Whitmore. He's doing beautifully." Henry smiled, a deep, contented expression. 10 miles away. Close enough that their paths might cross again someday. Far enough that Hope could live as he was meant to. Wild and free. Now, when Henry sits on his porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, he sometimes hears a sound carried on the wind. The distinctive call of a bobcat, fierce and proud. He likes to think it's Hope, marking his territory, announcing his presence to the world. And each time he hears it, Henry raises his mug in a silent salute to the wild soul he helped save, and who, in turn, had helped save him from his own isolation. The wilderness no longer feels empty to Henry. It feels full of possibility, of connections waiting to be made, of life persisting against all odds. In saving Hope, he'd remembered something Martha had always known, that love isn't diminished by loss, but rather grows to encompass new forms, new expressions, new souls in need of compassion. And sometimes, on the clearest nights when the stars shine brightest, Henry swears he catches a glimpse of amber eyes watching from the forest's edge, not threatening, not approaching, just acknowledging. A wild creature remembering a kindness, a man remembering what it means to care, and both understanding that some bonds transcend the boundaries we think exist between us. In the sprawling landscapes of rural Montana, where the pine forests meet the untamed wild, wildlife biologist Brittany Miller, a lifelong animal lover, had always cared for wildlife and never had a traditional pet like a dog, believed her expertise would naturally make her the center of their new, unconventional family. But when her husband, Bill, who never had or even wanted bobcats growing up, agreed to get some for her as a Christmas gift, Brittany jokingly feels like the third wheel in her own home because their two bobcats, Frank and Cole, seem to adore her husband Bill far more, despite her being the one who feeds them, gives them treats, brushes them, and cleans their enclosure. What made the man who knew nothing about wild animals becomes the wildcat's undisputed favorite, leaving the expert in the dust? This is a story of unexpected connections, the strange ways love transforms us, and how sometimes the family you never knew you needed finds you in the most surprising ways. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Brittany Miller stood at the kitchen counter, slicing carrots with methodical precision while glancing out the window at the backyard. Their spacious property in rural Montana stretched toward a fringe of pine forest, the perfect setting for the life she'd always dreamed of living. A life surrounded by wildlife, just not quite in the way it had turned out. Inside the custom-built enclosure that dominated half their yard, Frank paced energetically, his tufted ears alert, spotted coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The younger of their two bobcats never seemed to run out of energy. Meanwhile, Cole lounged on a high wooden platform, golden eyes half closed in contentment, watching his companion's antics with feline indifference. The sound of the front door opening caused both bobcats to snap to attention. "Honey, I'm home," Bill's deep voice called out. Brittany smiled to herself, starting the mental countdown. 3, 2, 1. Right on cue, Frank let out an excited yowl that echoed through the house while Cole stood and stretched leisurely, both bobcats suddenly animated by the arrival of their favorite human. "There they are. How are my boys doing today?" Bill's voice grew louder as he approached the glass door leading to the enclosure. Brittany set down her knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amusement and mock exasperation. "You know, I've been home with them all day. They didn't make a peep when I went out to clean their space, but the moment they hear your truck in the driveway..." Bill turned to her with a grin that still made her heart skip after 12 years of marriage. At 42, her husband had the kind of rugged handsomeness that seemed to improve with age. Salt and pepper hair, an impressive beard, and laugh lines etched around kind eyes. His forest ranger uniform was dusty from a day spent maintaining trails in Glacier National Park. "What can I say? It's my animal magnetism." He waggled his eyebrows. "Oh, please. You never even wanted pets growing up." She crossed her arms, failing to suppress her smile. "That was before I met these guys." Bill stepped outside to greet the bobcats properly, and Brittany followed, shaking her head. The relationship between her husband and their unconventional pets still amazed her daily. 3 years ago, if someone had told her that Bill, practical, steady Bill, who had initially balked at the idea of even a house cat, would become the favorite human of 2 rescued bobcats, she would have laughed in disbelief. The story had begun on a snowy December morning just before Christmas. Brittany had grown up surrounded by animals, spending summers volunteering at wildlife rehabilitation centers. As an adult, she'd turned that passion into a career as a wildlife biologist specializing in North American carnivores. But despite her professional work with wild animals, she'd never had conventional pets of her own. "I don't understand how someone who loves animals as much as you do never had a dog," Bill had commented one evening as they watched a nature documentary about big cats. "My parents were allergic to pet dander," Brittany explained. "And then I was always traveling for school and work. It wouldn't have been fair to have a pet I couldn't properly care for." She'd sighed wistfully at the bobcats on screen, explaining how these adaptable predators were her favorite native species, perfect combinations of house cat charm and wild dignity. Bill had listened attentively, asking questions about their habits and habitats, but she never suspected he was forming a plan. A week later, Bill had called her in the middle of the day, his voice vibrating with an unusual excitement. "Britt, I need you to keep an open mind about something." "That's never a good start to a conversation," she'd replied warily. "There's a wildlife sanctuary about 2 hours from here. They have 2 bobcats that need a new home. Brothers, bonded pair. They can't be released into the wild." Her heart had skipped. "Bill, what are you saying?" "I'm here now, looking at them. They were confiscated from an illegal exotic pet operation. The owner tried to raise them as pets without proper knowledge or facilities. They're too habituated to humans to be released. But the sanctuary is over capacity and looking for experienced wildlife handlers with proper facilities to adopt them. Brittany had sat down, mind racing. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Merry early Christmas? His voice had been tentative, hopeful. I know it's unorthodox, but you have all the qualifications. We have the land, and these guys need someone who understands them. She'd been speechless, torn between professional concern and personal longing. Bill, this isn't like adopting a puppy. Bobcats require specialized care, proper enclosures, dietary management. I know. That's why I came to check things out first. The sanctuary has a thorough application process. They've already conditionally approved us based on your credentials. You applied without telling me? Just preliminary paperwork. Nothing's decided. But Britt, you should see them. The younger one has been watching me like he's trying to figure me out. The older one is more reserved, but there's something about them. I think they need us. That was the moment she'd known something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Bill, who'd grown up in suburban Chicago without so much as a goldfish, was standing in a wildlife sanctuary, advocating for adopting 2 wild felines. You're serious about this, she'd whispered. Dead serious, but only if you want this too. She'd laughed, a sound somewhere between joyful and incredulous. Of course I want this, but I never thought you would. Well, he'd replied, his voice softening, sometimes you make compromises for the people you love. And sometimes those compromises turn out not to be compromises at all. 3 weeks later, after a flurry of permit applications, enclosure construction, and educational sessions at the wildlife sanctuary, they had welcomed Frank and Cole home. The Bobcats had arrived in large transport crates, frightened and disoriented. Brittany had prepared everything meticulously. A spacious outdoor enclosure connected to a climate-controlled indoor area, enrichment items, appropriate food, veterinary contacts, everything by the book. Remember, she'd instructed Bill nervously as they prepared to open the crates. No sudden movements, no loud noises. They'll need time to adjust. Might take weeks for them to feel comfortable around us. Bill had nodded solemnly, keeping a respectful distance as Brittany operated the crate doors with practiced ease. Cole, the older Bobcat at 4 years, had emerged first, cautious, dignified, his tawny coat marked with subtle spots and his face framed by magnificent facial ruffs. He'd surveyed his new territory with quiet intensity before finding a sheltered corner to observe from. Frank had burst out next, barely past kittenhood at 2 years old, all energy and curiosity despite his initial fear. Smaller than his brother but more boldly marked, with prominent spots and expressive tufted ears that swiveled at every sound. That first night, the humans had slept poorly, both periodically checking the security cameras trained on the enclosure. The Bobcats had kept to opposite ends, Frank exploring tentatively while Cole remained vigilant. They'll warm up eventually, Brittany had reassured Bill, trying to mask her own anxiety. These transitions are always difficult. Bill had nodded, squeezing her hand. They have the best possible caretaker. If anyone can make them feel at home, it's you. For the first month, Brittany had been the primary caretaker, feeding, cleaning, documenting behaviors, gradually habituating the Bobcats to human presence. Bill had kept a respectful distance, helping with maintenance but deferring to her expertise. The transformation had begun subtly. Cole, the more reserved brother, had started approaching the fence when Bill worked nearby, watching with intense golden eyes. I think he's curious about what you're doing, Brittany had commented one weekend as Bill reinforced part of the enclosure. Or plotting my demise, Bill had joked, though he'd glanced at the Bobcat with new interest. Frank had been more direct in his curiosity. One afternoon, while Bill sat quietly reading near the enclosure, the younger Bobcat had approached, pacing back and forth along the fence line before settling directly across from him, mirroring his posture. "I think you've made a friend," Brittany had whispered, amazed. Bill had looked up from his book, meeting Frank's unblinking stare. "Is that right, buddy? Are we friends now?" Frank had yawned dramatically, showing impressive teeth, then flopped onto his side in what seemed like deliberate nonchalance. Bill had laughed. "I'll take that as a maybe." By the third month, an unmistakable pattern had emerged. While both Bobcats tolerated Brittany, accepting food, allowing health checks, occasionally seeking attention, they positively lit up when Bill appeared. Frank would race to the fence, chirruping excitedly. Cole would assume a position of casual interest that fooled no one. "I don't understand it," Brittany had said, half amused, half confused. "I'm the one who feeds them every day. I'm the one who knows proper wildcat handling techniques. You barely knew what a bobcat was 3 months ago." Bill had shrugged, seemingly as puzzled as she was. "Maybe that's exactly why. You're the responsible parent. I'm the fun one who doesn't know any better." But as the months passed, the preference had only grown more pronounced. When they cautiously began supervised interactions inside the enclosure, Brittany always present with safety protocols in place, the Bobcat's favoritism became undeniable. Cole, who remained standoffish with Brittany, would approach Bill with slow blinks and body language that spoke of growing trust. Frank was less subtle, boldly rubbing against Bill's legs and soliciting scratches behind his tufted ears. "Traitors," Brittany had muttered one evening after Frank had completely ignored her attempt to engage him with a new enrichment toy, only to pounce on it enthusiastically when Bill touched it moments later. "They're not traitors," Bill had replied, failing to hide his pleased smile. "They just have specific taste in humans." Now, 3 years into their unusual family arrangement, the preferences had solidified into established fact. Brittany, professional wildlife biologist, lifelong animal enthusiast, daily caretaker, was firmly established as the Bobcat's second favorite human. A distant second, at that. Standing in the yard, she watched as Bill entered the secure area of the enclosure. Immediately, Frank bounded over, circling Bill's legs with happy chirps that sounded nothing like a house cat's meow, and everything like the wild animal he was. "Hey there, Frankie," Bill crooned, crouching to offer his knuckles for the Bobcat to rub against. "Did you have a good day? Did you terrorize your brother like usual?" Cole maintained his dignity for approximately 30 seconds before abandoning his perch to saunter over, tail twitching with poorly concealed excitement. "And there's the distinguished gentleman," Bill said, extending his other hand toward Cole. The older Bobcat sniffed it carefully before pressing his forehead against Bill's palm, a gesture of supreme trust from the normally reserved animal. Brittany leaned against the fence, shaking her head in mock despair. "You know, most men bring home flowers for their wives. Mine brought home Bobcats that love him more than they love me." Bill looked up with a grin. "They love you too. They're just..." Yeah, I know. I'm the mean mom who gives them medicine and trims their claws. You're the fun dad who sneaks them treats when I'm not looking?" "I would never," Bill protested, the picture of innocence despite the fact that they both knew he absolutely would and did. Frank chose that moment to perform his signature move, standing on his hind legs to place his front paws on Bill's chest, bringing them nearly face to face. At 40 pounds, the Bobcat wasn't small, and the gesture always made Brittany's heart rate spike, despite knowing that Frank had never shown a hint of aggression. "Careful," she cautioned automatically. "He's fine," Bill replied, maintaining eye contact with Frank. "Aren't you, buddy? You just want to say hello properly." The Bobcat chuffed softly before dropping back to all fours, apparently satisfied with the greeting. Cole, not to be outdone, pressed against Bill's side and began a rumbling purr that seemed impossibly loud for an animal his size. "I'm going to finish dinner," Brittany announced, suppressing a smile. "Try not to get completely covered in Bobcat hair before we eat." Inside the kitchen, she resumed her dinner preparations, listening to the sound of Bill's laughter mixed with the Bobcat's distinctive vocalizations. The whole situation was objectively absurd. Her husband, who had grown up in a household where houseplants were considered high maintenance, now communing with two wild predators who treated him like he was the best thing since sliced deer meat. Yet there was something undeniably heartwarming about it too. Bill had stepped completely out of his comfort zone for her, only to find an unexpected connection that now seemed essential to his happiness. The sliding door opened, and Bill stepped inside, brushing fur from his uniform. "Those two are extra energetic today," he commented, washing his hands at the sink. "Frank nearly knocked me over." "He's been pacing all afternoon," Brittany replied. "I think a storm's coming. They always get worked up before the barometric pressure drops." Bill dried his hands and came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What's for dinner, and can I help?" "Roast chicken with vegetables, and you can set the table." As they moved around the kitchen in comfortable domesticity, Brittany's thoughts drifted to the journey they'd taken together. Marriage was always about adaptation and surprise, but their particular path had included some truly unexpected turns. "Do you remember that first week after we brought them home?" she asked as they sat down to eat. "When you said you'd be happy if they eventually just tolerated your presence?" Bill laughed, reaching for the salt. "And now I can't even use the bathroom without Frank trying to follow me in. Just last week, I found him sitting outside the shower waiting for you." "Not me. You." "He's loyal," Bill said with mock solemnity. "A quality to be admired." "And what am I? Chopped liver? I'm the one who feeds them their actual chopped liver." "Maybe that's the problem," Bill teased. "They know where their food comes from. They think you're the mighty hunter who kills their prey. They respect you too much to cuddle." Brittany snorted. "Nice try. I think it's your beard. Seriously, Frank is obsessed with it. I've seen him trying to groom it." "It could be. Or maybe..." Bill's expression softened. "Maybe they sense that I needed them more than you did." "What do you mean?" Bill set down his fork, considering his words. "You've always been comfortable with animals. You understand them intuitively. But for me, connecting with Frank and Cole has been a revelation. I never knew I could feel this kind of bond with creatures that don't even belong in our world, really." "They belong exactly where they are," Brittany said firmly. "With us." After dinner, they settled on the couch to watch a movie, a routine that had evolved to include one extra step since the arrival of the Bobcats. Bill positioned himself directly in front of the large window that looked out onto the enclosure's indoor section, knowing that within minutes, both Bobcats would arrive to watch him watch the television. Sure enough, Frank appeared first, pressing his face against the glass with such intensity that his whiskers splayed outward. Cole followed more sedately, sitting beside his brother with his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. "Our audience has arrived," Bill commented, waving at the Bobcats. "Always punctual," Brittany replied, curling against his side. At least they can't physically squeeze between us anymore. Don't remind me. I still have scars from when Frank decided my lap was the only acceptable place to sleep. They both laughed, remembering the early days when they were still figuring out appropriate boundaries. There had been some painful lessons. Bobcats, even raised with humans, were not domestic cats. Their play could turn rough. Their independent nature could manifest as aggression, and their natural behaviors could wreak havoc on household items. "Remember when Cole shredded your favorite chair?" Brittany asked, as if reading his thoughts. "How could I forget? It was my fault for thinking he could be unsupervised inside. And when Frank opened every single kitchen cabinet except the one with his food? That was actually impressive. I'm still not sure how he figured out the child locks." They reminisced about the learning curve that had been steeper than either had anticipated. There had been property damage, minor injuries, and one memorable escape attempt that had ended with Bill in a tree, coaxing Frank down with pieces of chicken while Brittany tried not to have a panic attack below. Yet through it all, the bond had only strengthened. The Bobcats had adapted to their routines just as Bill and Brittany had adapted to the Bobcats' needs. Regular visits from their wildlife veterinarian confirmed that both animals were healthy and, as far as anyone could tell, content in their unusual living situation. Outside the window, Frank had lost interest in watching them and was now engaged in his evening ritual of grooming Cole, who tolerated the attention with typical stoicism. The younger Bobcat fastidiously licked his brother's ears, a behavior that both established his dominance and strengthened their bond. "They're good for each other," Brittany observed softly. "I can't imagine how lonely it would be for just one of them." "Like us," Bill replied, squeezing her hand. "Better together." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, confirming Brittany's prediction about approaching weather. She rose early, as usual, to prepare the Bobcats' breakfast while Bill showered. The complex diet she maintained for them included raw meat, vitamin supplements, and occasional whole prey items, a far cry from the simple kibble of domestic cats. As she carefully measured portions, she heard the familiar sound of Frank's impatient pacing in the indoor enclosure. I know, breakfast is coming," she called. When she entered the feeding area, both Bobcats were waiting. Frank pacing energetically, Cole sitting with dignity near the door. They accepted their food from her with enthusiasm that briefly overcame their usual preference for Bill. "See, you do love me when I have meat," she told them, watching as they ate with typical carnivore focus. After they finished, she spent time cleaning the enclosure while the Bobcats lounged nearby, occasionally showing interest in her activities, but mostly just observing. This was their routine. Comfortable, established, and entirely different from the life she'd imagined when she first fell in love with a city boy who knew nothing about wildlife. Bill appeared at the connecting door, dressed for work in his ranger uniform. Immediately, both Bobcats perked up, Frank letting out an excited chirp and bounding over. "I swear," Brittany muttered, "it's like they can smell you coming." "Probably can," Bill replied cheerfully, entering the secure area. "Morning, boys." He crouched down, and Frank immediately pressed his head against Bill's chin, a behavior that still made Brittany's professional side marvel. In the wild, Bobcats were solitary, territorial creatures. This level of affection, especially toward a male human, defied conventional wildlife behavior patterns. "Got a long shift today?" Bill told the Bobcats as if they understood every word. "But I'll bring you something nice when I get back." "Don't you dare bring home another dead thing," Brittany warned, though she couldn't help smiling. Last month, Bill had arrived with a roadkill deer he'd found, legally obtained with proper permissions, but still an unexpected addition to their freezer. No promises. He grinned, giving Frank a final scratch behind the ears before standing. Cole, keep your brother out of trouble. The older Bobcat blinked slowly in what Brittany had come to interpret as acknowledgement. After Bill left for work, Brittany faced her own workday, a combination of remote consulting for wildlife management agencies and local conservation projects that allowed her to work from home most days. She settled at her desk near the large window overlooking the Bobcat enclosure, where she could keep an eye on them while working. By mid-morning, the drizzle had intensified into a steady rain, driving the Bobcats into their sheltered areas. Frank paced restlessly in the indoor enclosure, clearly missing his usual outlets for energy. "I know, buddy," Brittany said, glancing up from her laptop. "Rainy days are boring." Frank paused in his pacing to look at her, then pointedly turned to stare at the door where Bill usually entered. The message couldn't have been clearer. Where is the fun, human? "He's at work," she explained, as if the Bobcat might understand. "And I'm right here, you know. I'm not chopped liver." Frank yawned dramatically and resumed pacing. Cole, more adaptable to quiet days, had settled on a high shelf, grooming himself with methodical precision. Occasionally, he would pause to watch Brittany, his golden eyes inscrutable. "At least you're not actively rejecting me," she told him. Cole blinked slowly before returning to his grooming, which Brittany chose to interpret as agreement. The day passed slowly, the rain continuing unabated. By late afternoon, both Bobcats were showing signs of restlessness that concerned Brittany. Bored predators could become destructive predators. Time for some enrichment, she decided, setting aside her work. She gathered several items she'd prepared for days like this: scent-infused toys, puzzle feeders, and a new element, a recording of Bill's voice she'd captured weeks ago for precisely this purpose. It was slightly manipulative, perhaps, but effective. When she played the recording of Bill talking soothingly to the Bobcats, both animals immediately perked up, looking around for their favorite human. Frank chirped questioningly, while Cole tilted his head in confusion. "Sorry, guys, it's just a recording," Brittany admitted as she distributed the toys. "The real thing will be home in a few hours." The enrichment activities kept them occupied for a while, but as the afternoon wore on, Brittany noticed Frank becoming increasingly agitated, pacing along the fence line and vocalizing in a way that seemed unusual even for him. "What's wrong, buddy?" she asked, concerned. "Storm making you nervous?" Frank ignored her, his attention fixed on something in the distance. Cole, too, had abandoned his typical calm demeanor and stood alert on his platform, ears swiveling toward the driveway. Brittany felt a prickle of unease. The Bobcat's senses were far sharper than human perception. If something had caught their attention, it warranted investigation. She grabbed a raincoat and stepped outside, scanning the property. The rain had slackened to a drizzle again, limiting visibility across their land. Nothing seemed amiss. No unusual vehicles, no wildlife too close to the house. Then she heard it. The distant, distinctive sound of a vehicle engine straining. Bill's truck from the sound of it, but not running properly. The Bobcats had heard it long before she could, their agitation now making perfect sense. She jogged down the driveway, rounding a bend to see Bill's Forest Service truck moving slowly toward the house, a plume of steam rising from under the hood despite the rain. "Bill!" she called, hurrying to meet him. The truck rolled to a stop and Bill emerged, looking harried but unhurt. "Hey, radiator hose blew about a mile back. Limped it home rather than wait for a tow in this weather." "Are you okay? You're late. I was starting to worry." I'm fine. Phone died, or I would have called. He gestured toward the truck. This old beast, on the other hand, needs some serious attention. They made their way back to the house together, Bill explaining the mechanical issues while Brittany updated him on her day. As they approached the Bobcat enclosure, the cat's behavior changed dramatically. From anxious pacing to animated excitement. Frank let out a series of loud chirps, racing back and forth along the fence line. Even Cole abandoned his dignity, moving quickly to the gate with his tail lashing expressively. "Someone's happy to see you," Brittany commented, unable to keep the wry amusement from her voice. Bill smiled, visibly cheered despite his difficult day. "At least someone appreciates me around here." "Hey, I appreciate you too," she protested, nudging him with her elbow. "I know." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "But you don't purr when I walk through the door." "I could try, but it might be weird." They laughed together, heading inside out of the rain. Even as Bill went to change out of his damp uniform, the Bobcats tracked his movement through the windows, refusing to settle until he reappeared and came to spend time with them. Later, as evening settled over their home, Brittany watched from the kitchen window as Bill sat in the covered portion of the enclosure. Frank was sprawled across his lap, eyes half closed in bliss as Bill stroked his spotted coat. Cole maintained a bit more dignity, sitting nearby but occasionally leaning in for attention. The scene painted a picture so far removed from what she'd expected their life to be, yet somehow perfect in its unexpectedness. When Bill joined her inside for dinner, his clothes covered in bobcat fur and his beard slightly damp where Frank had attempted to groom it, she couldn't help but smile. "What?" he asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing. Just thinking about how things work out in unexpected ways." Bill glanced toward the window where both Bobcats now sat watching, as if reluctant to let him out of their sight. "You mean how I went from city boy to Bobcat whisperer?" "Something like that." She passed him a plate. "When you brought them home, I never imagined they'd become so attached to you specifically. Feeling like a third wheel in your own field of expertise?" he teased gently. "A little," she admitted. "But mainly I'm just grateful." "For what?" "For you. For being willing to take such a huge step outside your comfort zone for me. And then for embracing it so completely." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Even if it means I'm perpetually third in line for attention around here." Bill squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "You know what's funny? 3 years ago, I went to that sanctuary thinking I was doing something entirely for you. I never expected to find something I didn't even know I was missing." Outside, Frank scratched at the window, impatient for Bill's return. Cole sat beside him, maintaining his dignity but equally intent. "I think your fan club is getting restless," Brittany said, nodding toward the window. Bill looked over his shoulder and smiled. "They can wait 5 minutes. Right now, my attention belongs to my first favorite mammal." Smooth talker. No wonder they love you. As they finished dinner, making plans to look at the truck's radiator in the morning and discussing a potential renovation to the Bobcat's enclosure, Brittany reflected on the strange, wonderful path they'd taken. A city boy who had never wanted pets had become the beloved human of 2 wild predators. A wildlife biologist who had spent her life studying animals from a professional distance had learned to share her home with the species she most admired, and together, they had created a family unlike any other, unconventional, occasionally chaotic, but filled with unexpected joy. When Bill returned to the enclosure after dinner, Brittany followed, watching as both bobcats immediately gravitated to him. Frank, as always, claimed prime position in Bill's lap, while Cole pressed against his side, rumbling purr audible even from a distance. "Room for one more?" she asked, approaching cautiously. To her surprise, Frank chittered at her without hostility, shifting slightly as if making space. Cole blinked slowly in what she'd come to recognize as feline acceptance. As she settled beside her husband, the bobcats rearranged themselves to accommodate her presence, not pushing her away, but inviting her into their circle. "Well, look at that," Bill said softly. "Turns out you're not the third wheel after all." "More like the fourth in a very strange quad," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. Frank stretched out dramatically, managing to extend across both their laps in a gesture that seemed deliberately inclusive. Cole, ever the gentleman, shifted to press against Brittany's side, his rumbling purr never faltering. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent and a clearing sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. Inside their unusual family circle, an equilibrium had been reached. Not what any of them had expected, perhaps, but exactly what they all needed. "You know," Bill said quietly, stroking Frank's spotted coat, "I may have brought them home for you, but I think they've given us both something we didn't know we were looking for." Brittany nodded, feeling Cole's steady heartbeat against her side. "A family, an unconventional one, but ours." As if understanding, Frank lifted his head to look at them both, golden eyes gleaming in the twilight, not choosing between them anymore, but accepting them together. The final piece of a puzzle none of them had realized needed solving.